article looks at why certification is going to make a substantial change to the way in which tourism and hospitality business in particular make their sustainability claims going forward. After 25 years of arguably not having many significant changes other than the Global Sustainable Tourism Council structuring the sector, the next big change that we're going to see now comes from new European legislation, in particular the legislation about empowering Green Claims Directive. There are many different stakeholders that will have a very key role to play here. The first one, of course, comes from the European Commission itself, introducing new legislation. We know that the Green Claims Directive at the moment is parked, but in effect, the empowering consumers for the green transition is going to have a substantial effect in any case. The key element of that legislation says you cannot make any claim without being able to have backup for making that claim. And that makes perfect sense. In advertising, companies already have known for a very long time you cannot make a claim with having evidence to back it up. So essentially all we're doing is moving into the area of green claims, some of the standards that have already been very well established for any other form of claim. So the surprising thing essentially is that we haven't been more strict with green claims. But the new element here is how these green claims now will need to be backed up by a third-party evidence. Okay? So we'll need to make sure that there is that third-party evidence. I know that it's moving into what the Green Claims Directive was supposed to do. Mostly what we're looking at the moment with empowering green consumers is saying you need to be able to back up what you're saying, and we need to know the certification bodies that you're working with and the backing up your claims have got robust systems in place. For example, third-party verification, and there are other criteria that we don't have the time to look into. Now, on the back of these new legislation from the EU, what we're finding is that particularly the large players, the online travel agents, the big tour operators, all the distribution channels now have additional due diligence to make sure that any of the claims that they are putting forward on behalf of their suppliers have been somehow verified. Now, you can pass that responsibility back to the hotels or the accommodation suppliers or tour guides and so on, or you can acknowledge some of that responsibility for yourself, and there will be varying levels of responsibility here. One thing that's really important to remember is that this legislation may be European, but it applies to your company irrespective of where in the world you happen to be. So the key base of this policy is if you are selling to European customers, irrespective of where in the world you are located, this policy and this legislation applies to you. And on that basis, I would assume there is no organization in the world, of any scale anyway, that is not targeting European consumers in one way or another. And therefore, this becomes a global legislation. So we have two groups of very active stakeholders at the moment. Obviously, certification bodies will suddenly find that there is a substantial increase in demand. In the study that accompanies this video, you will see that in 1 year only, there was a significant increase in the number of companies that applied for certification and achieved that certification and then showed it on the booking.com portal. We also noticed, however, that there was inequality in who was able to apply and who was able to achieve that in that short period of time. This tends to be an issue when we have legislation coming in, and I know there is some time for people to adjust, for organizations to be able to adjust to this, but certification bodies, particularly the ones that will be stronger, will have more robust systems, and are finding that suddenly there is an increased demand in certification, but that demand comes mostly from larger organizations, essentially hotel groups that have said that they have now made a commitment that all of their hotels will become certified by a particular date. And normally that date is somewhere in end of 2025 or end of 2026, depending on their internal policies, but mostly tends to be before the end of 2026, which is when this legislation will be kicking in. Of course, what we are seeing is so many of the hotels that are smaller are not yet in a position to do this, either because they don't have the necessary advice from the industry associations, from their tourist boards, that this legislation is coming in, or because they haven't yet seen the possibility certification could be a tool that has got the cost benefit that will really help them to become a more competitive business. I would expect in the next 5 years there will be a consolidation in the numbers of certification bodies that until now have been working independently and sometimes competing with one another. There are economies of scale in certification that at the moment have not been realized. And in the 25 years since I've been working in this sector, and I wrote a book on tourism eco-labeling in 2001. I am surprised that the fundamentals have not changed necessarily. Everything else in our life has changed in the last 20 years or so. And yet in here we have so many of the certification bodies that have not evolved at the speed that we have seen other sectors to evolve. So I'm expecting in the next few years, some of the certification bodies could be working together. There could be a consolidation. Teams that at the moment have run their independent certification program could essentially become on-the-ground consultants or auditors for bigger certification bodies. There could be the standardization in criteria and increasing the robustness of verification processes that we all know that we need. The challenge we could have with this is that this could come at the expense of increased costs. Okay, and so we have to find a way in which we are not making certification prohibitive to the small businesses. And for this, we are going to need substantial support from local, regional and national industry associations. And we're going to need a lot of capacity building and support from destination management authorities. I think it's important that when we introduce new legislation, we consider both the positive intended consequences as well as the potential unintended negative consequences. And very often we find that the small organizations do not have the lobbying power or do not have the voice to be heard, or that the only small organizations that we tend to hear are the ones that are already very well placed to participate in stakeholder consultations. But those organizations are not necessarily representative of the average small organization that will be affected by new legislation.